Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today is episode 40 of the Church Fathers. I'm again joined by Logos. We'll be covering chapters 11 to 20 of Justin's Hortatory address to the Greeks. So, in chapter 11, having accepted that the philosophers are untrustworthy due to their disagreements with themselves, Justin appeals to the Greek oracles. He argues that one such oracle claims wisdom only came from the Chaldeans and Hebrews, which he argues is referring to Moses, whom God honored as the first of the prophets. 12. Justin seeks to show that Moses is older than the philosophers, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, as well as Philip of Macedon and his son Alexander. He states the Greeks know little of their own history prior to the Olympiads. That's the original Olympics, and that began in 776 BC. At this early date, the use of letters were newly introduced through Phoenicia, as is described by Cadmus. Plato testifies in the Timaeus that Solon, the wisest of men, spoke to the Egyptian priests, who called the Greeks ever children. Nothing Greek is old, but it is new in relation to the Egyptians and Chaldeans and Hebrews. So the first thing I'll say here is that I don't know who this oracle is that he's referring to, and given that Justin mishandled Diodorus so badly, I'm not inclined to believe there ever was such an oracle. But I do have a question for you, Logos. You've read the Timaeus. Did the Egyptian priests ever say that the Greeks were always young?
I don't know. It's been too long since I've read it to remember little things like that. I remember the bigger beats, not the details. I'll have to read it again.
Okay, 13. Justin points to the value and worth of the Hebrew scriptures by pointing to Ptolemy of Egypt, who, in order to fill his library with the works of the world, ordered a Greek translation of the Hebrew scriptures. Justin reports the legend that 70 men in separate cells, in no communication with each other, translated the LXX exactly the same. It's also known as Septuagint. Proof of a miracle, Justin asserts that the Old Testament text belonged to the Christians, not the Jews. This is a rehash of themes we've seen in the dialogue with Trypho. I don't think there's anything new to comment on that.
That interesting twist that belongs to the Christians and not the Jews. I don't remember us talking about that before. What's the argument for that?
Well, we did in the dialogue with Trypho. The basic idea is, so the prophecies in the Old Testament, as we saw in the dialogue with Trypho, Justin believes were fulfilled in the time of Christ for the Christians. So the question then is, who can best lay claim to the Old Testament? Because if the Jews deny that the promises that were made did not happen in the time of Christ, then there's problems, right? How do you account for these things?
Okay, example, I remember that part. Yeah. I thought there was something about the translation of the Septuagint itself that was Christian leaning, and that's the new part I don't remember us talking about.
Oh, no.
Okay.
He's just, because the reason why he references a Septuagint here is because he's saying that even the king of the Greeks in Egypt thought that the Old Testament was so valuable as a source of knowledge that he translated it into his own tongue.
Got it.
Right, that's because he's writing to Greeks, and he's trying to say, well, you Greeks ought to care about the Old Testament because look at what Ptolemy did.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Right, that's the point. All right, and then chapter 14. We are here, chapter 14. Justin continues on his erroneous reading of Diodorus Siculus, arguing that the wisdom of the Egyptians is from Moses, and that the Greeks, Orpheus, Homer, and Solon, along with Pythagoras and Plato, who learned from the Egyptians' wisdom, are in turn indebted to Moses. So one of the things we've seen, at least with Justin, and we'll see what the other church fathers are like, in order to make a case to the Greeks, he's really willing to stretch things a lot, isn't he, Logos?
Yeah, from the looks of it.
And we've sort of already talked about this before. One interpretation is that he really just did stretch it a lot, which is kind of sus, or it was added to later. But then, if these are obviously false statements, then why would a later Christian do this? Because in the end, it just makes Justin look bad, right? So,
yeah.
The one thing that does help, I don't remember his name exactly, but in the time of the Maccabees, so this is like 300 years before Justin, there were Jewish writers that were trying to make a connection between Moses and the Greek philosophers. And they in turn fabricated documents that at the time people didn't really realize were fabricated. And I think a lot of the Christian authors fell for those.
Oh, that sounds like something interesting to look into. I don't know much about the Maccabees.
that doesn't account for reading Diodorus incorrectly. But nonetheless, there are. I remember looking this up because there was a reference in Plutarch's Life of Numa that the idea that the Pythagoreans taught that God could only be known by the intellect and that Numa prescribed images in Rome. And Clement of Alexandria claimed that that was proof that he had read Moses. And that itself was from a Jewish source, which had been fabricated, which at the time I don't think was widely known. So that might explain some of it.
Makes sense.
Let's see. Okay, chapter 15. Justin appeals to the poet Orpheus, who, from the Egyptians, learned about the oneness of God, the only begotten, even if he adulterated this knowledge with other lesser gods, i.e., polytheism. And then in 16, Justin appeals to the Sibyl, who speaks of a single unbegotten God. Okay, 17. Justin argues that even Homer saw the need for including a single unbegotten God. I think he's a little weaker on Homer because he quotes from this guy Phoenix, and it says, "Not though God himself were to promise that he would peel off my old age and give me the vigor of my youth." I mean, that could just be Jupiter, right? Because Jupiter would be the capital G God, and all the other gods would have lowercase g. So
yeah, it's interesting that you said that, because when I was reading these passages, they seem so out of context. I'm like, I don't want to smugly interpret them as being able to talk about anything, but I'm not seeing enough here to make me think they're not referring to something in the pantheon itself.
Right. Well, to the case with Homer, I think, yeah, this is not, and then also the little bit about Ulysses, where he says, we better have one king, monarchy, than chaos. That's not Ulysses talking about or one god, just that Jupiter ought to be the head of the gods. Otherwise, you'd have chaos, right?
Right.
And so, let's see. Yeah, Orpheus and the Sibyl, again, Orpheus, the Sibyl, and Homer could all just be speaking about Jupiter. There's no reason to think other. Now, there are a few, I guess, if we go back a little bit. We talk about unbegotten God, and of course, Jupiter was begotten by Kronos. And then we can talk about Orpheus, and he also mentions, I don't know if he mentions unbegotten.
One self-begotten and the only one.
Okay. So if that's a correct translation, then yeah, that couldn't be Jupiter himself, because he himself was begotten.
Right.
Now, with Sophocles, he says, he also appeals to Sophocles, who seems to have this little ditty against idols. But again, I don't know the broader context of what Sophocles is quoting here. This might not even be in his own opinion. So, hard to tell.
Yep. I wish there were sources on the pages from where Justin might have got this from, so we can go back and look for ourselves. That'd be super helpful.
It would be, because some of these I couldn't really find either. So 19, Pythagoras says the first principle of all things is unity. He teaches that God is one and alone. He states that unity belongs to that class of things that can be perceived by the mind. God is one, does not exist outside the world, but in it. He is present in the circle. The first principle of all things is light and intelligence, which moves the universe. Now, one with Pythagoras, I think he's on better ground. As I mentioned before, Pythagoras believed that God was could only be seen by the intellect. Numa gives the account of Plutarch about Numa, which he describes as the doctrine of the Pythagoreans. This is, I think, probably a better case than Sophocles, the Sibyls, and Homer. Or, sorry, not Homer. So what was the first one he used? Orpheus. There you go. But you had some to say about Pythagoras, Logos.
Well, the section kind of confused me, because he's going to talk about Pythagoras, and you can see in the next chapter, Plato. But he just got done talking about how these philosophies contradicting each other and hence themselves. And so it strikes me as fun how you can't trust these terrible philosophers in the first part of the thing because of how much they contradict themselves and each other. And now when it's convenient, he's going to bring them in and say, but look, now that we're on the subject, look what these fine fellows have to say about God. Right. I thought that was interesting. Now, about Pythagoras himself, the clause I found most interesting here is he himself does not, as some supposed, exist outside the world, but in it. Um,
Yeah.
that's kind of interesting. How can God exist in the world if he creates it? I mean, that seems to me to be wholly inconsistent with, say, the Genesis account of creation.
Right. Well, the Pythagoreans, who then dovetail with the Platonists, I know the Platonists believed in the idea of emanation, right? So it's plausible or possible that the Pythagoreans did too. Now, that won't help Christians because that conflicts with quite a few doctrines about creation and the nature of God himself.
Yeah, I mean, there's some interesting reading of Genesis we talked about last week where God hovers over the spirit of the waters, and so the foundation of all thing is water, or something like that. And so you could make a case that God is kind of like an emanating force that orders the world around it from chaos to cosmos or something. But even still, that would strike me as more Platonic, where you have this canvas that's always existing. The emanations of God are bringing order to it and sustaining being, and so on, which you might hear about from like Thomists or something like that. But this idea that God is in the world, I don't know how one could reconcile that with Christianity in any way. That seems really interesting.
Yeah, yeah. I think what Justin is merely trying to say here is that there's another Greek who's arguing for that there be one God. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, that's a strange thing there. But back to your point, if you remember way, way back, Logos, to the Apology, he really liked Pythagoras and Plato. He said that these were like proto Christians who were martyrs for the truth.
Oh, that's right. He did say that.
And now he's just like dunking on Plato relentlessly. And it's like, wait a minute. Wait a minute. What is up with that, Logos?
And he dunks on him, and now here he's going to try to use them again.
I know. It is interesting. It is interesting. Chapter 20. Justin claims Plato was informed by the doctrines of Moses and the prophets. Plato was accused of not recognizing the gods of Athens. Plato said everything made was mortal and the gods were made. If the gods were made of matter, are they not evil? Since elsewhere Plato says that the material is evil, he did this to say that such gods are no gods at all. Plato says there is an over god over all the other gods of Olympus. This he gathered from the doctrines of Moses he found in Egypt, especially I am that I am. This I am that I am, Logos, is a lot of work down the ages, doesn't it?
It kind of does, especially since it doesn't seem to me that you have to look at like Old Testament stuff for Plato to come to this. I mean, just look at the Euthyphro dilemma. This question that Plato himself was grappling with about how you are to please all these different gods with different things, who want different things with different rituals. Who interprets what the gods want? How do you reconcile both of them? You know, that entire question was how do we normatively act on what's pious? Um, and so from that alone, I could see Plato getting to, okay, we're going to have to hold some law about the gods above all over the laws. Otherwise, you get this chaotic situation. And then from there, he has to have some kind of account of what this god above gods would have to be like, which seems to be where you get the Timaeus and stuff. So, I mean, I think from what I've read in the Blackwell Companion of Plato, I think he did have some conversation with Magi from Babylon, Egypt, or somewhere in that area. Um, and I'm sure that some of what they said had some influence on him, especially Eastern influences about reincarnation and stuff you'd find in the Phaedo. But I don't think that he dipped purely into the Old Testament to get there.
Well, Pythagoras also went to the Magi in Babylon to study mathematics. Well, but then again, remember the whole appeal to Moses is based on an erroneous, so far, an erroneous reading of Diodorus. And while it's not come up yet, I've seen in other contexts a fraudulent Jewish source connecting Platonism to Moses, which at the time I don't think was known to be fraudulent, but certainly by the Christians. They weren't the authors of this idea. But this all sounds to me not like Plato, but Epicurus. Epicurus was the one that said the gods were material, not Plato. In the funeral dialogues, he doesn't, in the Republic, he doesn't deny that the gods are gods. He says that Homer speaks falsehood about the gods.
Yeah, this again might be referring to the Timaeus as well, where the lowercase g gods like Zeus are said to be like demiurges, maximal manifestations of the forms. So if you have like the form of lightning, then the maximal embodiment of what it is to be lightning is going to be Zeus. So there's like the form of lightning, which can't manifest in reality at all. It's like the sun, who projects shadows onto the cave wall, and Zeus would be like the very best picture you could get in the cave of what it is like to be lightning, and so on for all the lowercase g gods. And so most of this is coming back to Timaeus, and so I'm about to do some reading on this one and figure out like how does Timaeus sit in the other Platonic dialogues? Is it early? Is it middle? Is it late? What do historians think about that? And how does it seem to reflect his other thinking? Because it's kind of an oddball. I mean, we did a lot of work on some of the Platonic dialogues. We put it on hold for a bit. We'll get back to it someday. But it seemed to me that we were reading through these dialogues and getting kind of like this narrative where Plato was growing and talking about different problems and stuff, and thinking about where we've been and where we're going in that investigation. I'm thinking about how the Timaeus relates to all of it. It's such a really weird thing to read compared to what we've read. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah. The other thing that's interesting is that, Justin is arguing that the pagans can't be trusted because all of these different sects disagree with each other. Of course, that's exactly the claim that the atheist makes against modern day Christianity.
That's true. Yep.
So what this shows us is that that's not really an argument. Because if you were to put Justin in a time machine and he were to come to the present, he wouldn't then say, oh, well, because of all this disagreement amongst these Christian denominations, I'm going to be an atheist now.
Definitely not. Definitely not. Well, and it just helped if we were consistent. If the disagreement among these philosophical sects were a problem, then he wouldn't use them for his own ends later. At least he'd just consistently put them off to the side as a problem.
Right. Now, obviously, I don't want to go too far with this analogy because it's going to be insulting to Justin. But a lot of slippery argumentation that Justin makes over these works we've read kind of reminds me of modern day online Catholics.
That's too far. That's too far.
I know you can't go too far with it, but some of these arguments are pretty slippery.
They are.
And I could see where if you just don't have any standards at all and you just want to go all the way, you end up with a Thomist.
Yeah.
I mean, because again, some of these claims could be easily verified, and I don't know why he'd say them, like the reading of Diodorus. Any Greek who was literate, since that's the audience, a literate group of Greeks who he's clearly assuming these Greek audience reads poetry, read Homer and Orpheus, reads philosophy, reads history. This is a literate, educated community he's talking to. Well, okay, then they would be able to call this out. So, I mean, maybe that's why Christianity didn't spread as much, and Justin wasn't that effective at proselytizing.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I don't know. Is there anything else you want to add, Logos, or before we wrap this up?
No, this was definitely a shorter one than most weeks, probably because there just wasn't too many tangents to go on. He was pretty forward about what he was doing. I don't know. So far, I'm kind of disappointed. I was hoping to see much more engagement with the pagans. I was hoping he'd like pick a work of Plato's and just like dive in and see what's going on. Like a contemporary Christian take on the Phaedo would have been really, really interesting to read. Hopefully I'll still see something like that, but I don't know. I'm not seeing it from Justin. What do you think?
Well, we're almost done with Justin, so don't hold your breath. You might see some more from some of the later fathers.
Hope so.
Right, everybody. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.